Every day it seems like Americans are butting their noses into other countries' business, whether it's sending military aid to Ukraine or using sanctions to try to influence Iran's nuclear program. But for all the places where the US has stuck its oar in, there are plenty of other places where it hasn't. So here's a list of countries where America has never interfered in the affairs of state. Cue the national anthem of Armenia. The United States has had a complicated history with this mountainous landlocked country, sandwiched between the Caucasus and Central Asia. But throughout all the geopolitical turmoil that has shaken the region, since Armenia declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, America has mostly stayed out of it, maintaining a policy of non-interference that to have cooperated on some issues like trade and human rights. But the US has never meddled in Armenia's internal politics. There's been a lot of that going around in Georgia as well, since the Rose Revolution of 2003, which saw the US support the removal of an authoritarian president. Washington has generally steered clear of getting involved in Georgia's domestic affairs. Instead, the American focus has been on helping Georgia develop economically and democratically, which is why the US was so disappointed when the former President Mikhail Saakashvili, who came to power in the wake of the Rose Revolution, was forced out by his successor in 2013. Nevertheless, Uncle Sam has resisted the urge to intervene and instead has worked to strengthen ties with Georgia's new leadership. As they say, it's always darkest before it's completely black, while the US has had little choice but to stay out of Armenia and Georgia. The same can't be said for Cuba. For over half a century, the two countries have been at loggerheads. First over the revolution that overthrew the US-backed Batista regime in 1959, and then over the US embargo of the island. In 1961, the US attempted to invade Cuba with a force of 1,400 Cuban exiles trained by the CIA, but the mission ended in disaster. Ever since then, the US has taken a hands-off approach to governing Cuba, although that hasn't stopped it from trying to influence the island's future through economic sanctions, which have been in place since 1958. Only time will tell if these sanctions will ever be lifted. Another country that has managed to stay off America's radar is Laos. Despite being neighbors in the Indochina region, the United States and Laos have had surprisingly little interaction. This is partly due to the fact that Laos is a relatively small and poor country, which has made it less of a priority for US foreign policy makers. Additionally, Laos's strategic location between China and Vietnam has made it a buffer state, which has historically made it more difficult for outside powers, including the United States, to influence its affairs. As a result, the US has maintained a policy of non-interference in Laotian affairs, focusing instead on building economic and diplomatic ties. One country that used to be very much on America's radar is Japan. After World War II, the US occupied Japan and helped to rebuild it into one of the world's most prosperous economies. But as Japan has become more and more democratic and economically powerful, the US has increasingly backed off, even though both countries are allies. In recent years, the US has focused on strengthening Japan's ability to defend itself so that it can take on a larger role in the region. And while the US has provided military assistance to Japan, it has generally avoided interfering in Japanese domestic politics. That might be because America's relationship with Japan is a lot more complicated than it first appears. From an American perspective, Japan is an important ally in a volatile part of the world. But Japan also represents a challenge to the United States as a formidable economic competitor. Even today, Japan's economy is the third largest in the world. So while the US may not interfere in Japan's internal affairs, it does keep a close eye on its external behavior. Some countries aren't on America's radar simply because they were never on the map. When the US purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, It gained control of this remote Arctic territory. But until the mid-20th century, the United States didn't do much to administer it. That's because the US didn't really know what to do with this barren wasteland. There was no gold rush, no oil boom, and few people lived there. Today, however, things have changed dramatically. The US has invested heavily in the infrastructure of American Samoa, which now has paved roads, modern buildings, and even an international airport. But despite all of this development, American Samoa still operates under a US territory rather than becoming a state. One reason for this is that the United States doesn't want to set a bad example for other territories, like Puerto Rico and Guam. If American Samoa becomes a state, then what's to stop the other territories from demanding statehood as well? As a result, the United States has deliberately kept American Samoa out of the spotlight. And finally, we come to the country that has managed to stay off America's radar for the longest time. In fact, the US didn't even know about this country until 1820, when it was discovered by an American naval officer named Edmund Custis. The United States could easily have annexed the island, but instead opted to leave it alone. Why? Because Uncle Sam was busy expanding his empire elsewhere. But today, the US is no longer interested in acquiring new territories. As a result, it has maintained a policy of non-interference in the affairs of this tiny Pacific island, which means that the people of Palau are free to live in peace and quiet. Until next time, it's me.